welcome. This is the Ben Shapiro Show. Got a lot coming up for you this hour. You know, any day is a good day when Robert Mugabe dies. That guy was terrible. That guy was an evil dictator, like a true evil dictator in Zimbabwe, killing all of his enemies, seizing land from just an awful, awful human being. In a little while, we're going to have on Helen Andrews, former editor at National Review and the Washington Examiner, and she's going to tell us about the history of Zimbabwe and Robert Mugabe. We're also going to be taking your calls a little bit later on in the hour at 855-236-3228. That is 855-236-3228 in a Friday phone frenzy. Alliteration there for you, just dropping it like it's hot. But we'll begin at this hour with a new YouGov poll showing that both Joe Biden and Bernie Sanders have lower favorability ratings than Donald Trump, which does say something good for Trump. I mean, the fact is that people are constantly focusing in on how unpopular Trump is, and that makes sense. I mean, Trump is not a popular president. In the Real Clear Politics poll average, he has never surpassed 45% in approval rating. He has never dropped below about 38, but that ain't great for a re-elect campaign. Right now, however, according to this new YouGov poll, Biden is underwater by 9. Only 42% favorable, 51% unfavorable. Bernie Sanders at 42% favorable, 50% unfavorable for a net -8. Trump is at 46% favorable, 52% unfavorable. That's pretty shocking, obviously. Most of the other Democratic candidates are underwater on favorability. So that is pretty bad news for the Democrats, obviously. So this could be an outlier. It could be just not a solid poll. Whatever it is, it does show that the Democrats do have a few endemic problems. Joe Biden continues to have endemic problems. Like, is he conscious? Is he a sentient being at this point? Or is he basically just a character from VeggieTales running for president? Like a near vegetable. Democratic frontrunner Joe Biden was speaking at a televised town hall on Wednesday when the corner of his left eye appeared to fill with blood, which is always a great look. You're running for president and suddenly you turn into the villain from Casino Royale. It started dripping down his cheek. It was bringing attention away from the issue of climate change at a time when his campaign is already battling back scrutiny about his age and health, according to the Washington Examiner. The eye issue isn't serious, as I said at the time. It will probably go away on its own after a few days, but people keep asking him if he's too old to run for president, or if he's going to collapse into a van, like Hillary Clinton did. And it ain't great when people are asking you this early on whether you are too old to run for president. Now, people aren't asking that of Bernie Sanders because everybody just assumes that the guy's loony. And you don't have to worry about him going senile. It's a little late in the case of Bernie Sanders. But Joe Biden is supposed to be the one who provides you a sense of calmness, a sense of sanguinity about the future. And instead, he was providing sanguinity in a different way. The root of sanguine is blood. So that, if you missed that pun. In any case, Joe Biden continues to be the polling front runner, but he is a weak and vulnerable front runner. The ranking committee over at the Washington Post is moving around the rankings right now where they're putting people. They've got Elizabeth Warren in the top slot. They've had Elizabeth Warren in the top slot for a little while. They've got Joe Biden at number 2, and they've got Bernie Sanders at number 3. Kamala Harris has dropped down into the second tier, along with Pete Buttigieg and Cory Booker. Beto O'Rourke barely holding on. Amy Klobuchar filled with binders full of useless. That's how they are stacking it up. And I think that that's probably right at this point, especially given the glowing media coverage that Elizabeth Warren has been receiving. The Washington Post says that ABC News is hosting next week's debate. They should try to tamp down interruptions, tease out candidates' policies, test their political radar. But that's probably not going to happen. It'll turn into Rock'em Sock'em Robots. It'll be fascinating to see how exactly all of this breaks down. Now, this does not mean that Republicans should be too sanguine either. Some bad news for Republicans, if you're looking for a Republican victory. Howard Schultz has dropped out as an independent. That's not great for Trump. The reason it's not great for Trump is because the assumption was that a few moderate Democrats might throw their votes to Howard Schultz in the same way that a lot of people voted independent in the last election cycle in 2016. And that may have provided the margin of difference in a lot of the key swing states. According to CNN, former Starbucks CEO Howard Schultz will not run for president in 2020. He posted a letter to his website on Friday. It said, "My belief in the need to reform our two-party system has not wavered, but I have concluded that an independent campaign for the White House is not how I can best serve our country at this time." Democrats, of course, were worried that he'd be siphoning off votes from them. Schultz acknowledged their concerns, writing, quote, "Not enough people today are willing to consider backing an independent candidate because they fear doing so might lead to re-electing a uniquely dangerous incumbent president." So in other words, Schultz says, I'm too afraid that I'm going to throw the election to Trump if I run, which, I mean, frankly, he's a Democrat, so that's not a giant shock. But it does suggest that there is a middle road in this presidential race to be filled. President Trump could fill that if he would stop being quite as off-putting as he has been, considering how quickly the Democrats are swiveling to the far left. But with Schultz out, Trump is going to need to appeal to a lot of those swing voters who may have gone to a third-party candidate and thus helped President Trump in the race. Meanwhile, Texas Republicans are sounding the alarm, according to The Hill, as Democratic presidential candidates get ready for their debate next week in Houston. They're warning that the Lone Star State could become more purple if the party doesn't actually pour money into Texas. Now, if the Republicans are stuck pouring money into Texas, it's a bad election cycle for Republicans. Most in the Texas GOP are pretty confident Trump will win Texas. He won, after all, last time around by 6 points. Ted Cruz won by 2. Mitt Romney won the state by 12. But Texas Republicans are worried they'll lose more House seats, a cycle after Democrats clawed back 2 districts as they retook their majority. 5 House Republicans have retired. 3 of those are in seats targeted by Democrats. The nonpartisan Cook Political Report rates all of these seats as either toss-ups or lean Democratic. James Dickey is chairman of the Texas Republican Party. He says, "We need all hands on deck and all Texans to pull together to make sure we don't let the Democrats put an end to the longest successful run in Texas history." George Shea is a Dallas businessman, a top GOP fundraiser. He says, "There's a lot of apathy and smugness and laziness here on the Republican side that's got to be reversed, or there will be a shock to the system at some point." According to The Hill, demographics are slowly but surely changing the state as an influx of voters from California and other left-leaning states move to Texas. Now, that's been the conventional wisdom, but I've seen studies that actually suggest that it's not expatriates from California changing Texas, it's actually young Texans. And the Republican Party hasn't been doing a solid enough job of drawing those young Texans into their category, and President Trump has not been helping along those lines, just on a pure numbers level. GOP support is eroding in all of the suburbs. That, of course, is the area where Trump is most likely to saw off support for Republicans. Those suburbs surrounding Houston and Dallas and Austin and San Antonio. That's worrisome to Republicans who are leery of President Trump's popularity with suburban voters. No Democrat has won statewide in Texas since 1994. Trump won Texas by only 9, in 2016. That is the worst showing for a Republican presidential candidate in about 20 years. And that's with Hillary Clinton on the ticket. So it really isn't about Trump losing the state. The question is whether Republican losses in the House make it impossible for Republicans to retake the House even if Trump wins. Brendan Steinhauser is an Austin-based GOP political strategist. He says, quote, "Doing the kind of outreach that we need to be doing is on everyone's mind, from elected officials to the local county chairman. It's time to follow through." But the party has a new problem, which is that a lot of white women who voted for Trump in 2016 are abandoning him ahead of the 2020 election cycle. So for all the talk about Trump as great and good leader who is going to lead the party to victory, maybe that happens, or maybe Trump has some pretty significant down ballot effect in a lot of the suburbs that Republicans need to win in a lot of these growing areas. Now, you can see the eagerness on the part of hardcore Democrats. Michelle Goldberg, who writes an awful column for the New York Times. In fact, there are very few columnists for the New York Times who do not write awful columns repeatedly. Michelle Goldberg has a piece called "Dare We Dream of the End of the GOP?" It's always a weird question. Like, I don't wish for the end of the Democratic Party. I wish for them to stop being crazy. I'm not a big fan of one-party governance. I think that we ought to have 2 viable political parties. My fear is that the Republicans have the right agenda, but lose to a party that has an insane agenda. But a lot of Democrats would like to see one-party rule, even though it has failed in places like California, even though it has failed in places like New York. Michelle Goldberg says that there's a new book by a Democratic pollster called RIP GOP, which is an astonishing title. Stanley Greenberg, this pollster, makes a thrilling prediction, says Michelle Goldberg, delivered with the certainty of prophecy. The year 2020 will produce a second blue wave on at least the scale of the first in 2018, and finally will crash and shatter the Republican Party that was consumed by the ill-begotten battle to stop the new America from governing. It sounds almost messianic, says Michelle Goldberg. The Republican Party, that foul agglomeration of bigotry and avarice that has turned American politics into a dystopian farce, not just defeated but destroyed. Yeah, those are the people I want to put in charge, and here you have the problem in its obvious extremity. Too many Democrats sound like Michelle Goldberg, right? The Republican Party isn't just wrong on policy. It's an agglomeration of bigotry and avarice and evil. It's dystopian. Okay, you may not like President Trump's tweets. I don't like a lot of President Trump's tweets. If you think that governance by President Trump is dystopian, you're a moron. Really, I don't know what to tell you. It is not dystopian governance. That's patently crazy. Okay, so for all the people like Michelle Goldberg who are like, Republican governance is dystopian, it's terrible, it's avarice and bigotry and blah, blah, blah. Okay, there is a new labor report out today, a new jobs report, 130,000 jobs gained in the month of August. We now have the lowest black unemployment rate in history in the United States. That's not according to me. That's according to CNBC. They reported it today.
Rate among blacks that dropped to 5.5% and is now at the lowest level on record.
Okay, and it's not just CNBC reporting these good numbers. It's also CNN. CNN was forced to report the fact that the labor force participation rate increased, and so did wages, which is actually pretty good news for the economy. Does this sound like a dystopia? Like 3.7% unemployment, you can say basically what you want. The government is shrinking in terms of regulation, and we don't have any major foreign crises. Does that sound dystopian to you? Or are you just kind of pissed because you don't like Trump as a person? Which is what most of these Democrats feel like at this point. Here's CNN acknowledging that the economy is pretty solid.
The job market's still marching forward, but at a slower pace. 130,000 net new jobs created, and 25,000 or so of those were census jobs, federal hiring. So without the census, you would have had a little bit of a weaker job market than even we're showing here. Take a look at the jobless rate, 3.7%. This remains near a historic generational low. About more than 500,000 people entered the labor market. So these months and months and months of decent job numbers are encouraging people to come back in. So that is an important sign of success in the labor market right now.
Dystopian, frightening, dystopian, job creation, terrible, dystopian, terrible. Again, you may not like President Trump and his Sharpie gate. You may think that his tweets are foolish. That is not anywhere close to, we live in a dystopian American run by racists and bigots. Then Trump is really bad at racism and bigotry, since a lot of black people are employed under this administration more than any administration in American history. So there's that. We are joined right now by Helen Andrews. She's former editor at National Review and the Washington Examiner, and she's the author of a forthcoming book on the baby boom generation. She has a great piece today about Zimbabwe. Robert Mugabe, who's this historic figure in African history, died today, and that's very good for anybody who likes, like human rights and values. And yet the tributes to him have been mixed. I mean, the New York Times, they have a headline today called "Robert Mugabe, Strong Man Who Cried Zimbabwe is Mine, Dies at 95, and it contains these two paragraphs. It says, in his final years in power, Mr. Mugabe presided over a shattered economy and a fractured political class that was jockeying for influence in anticipation of his death. Though often viewed in the West as a pariah, he was, in many corners of Africa, considered an elder statesman, thanks to his liberation pedigree, his longevity, and his eloquence in articulating a broad resentment of Western powers' past and present policies toward the continent. If Nelson Mandela of South Africa, his contemporary, won universal admiration for emphasizing reconciliation, Mr. Mugabe tapped into an equally powerful sentiment in Africa, that the West had not sufficiently atoned for its citizens and had continued to bully the continent. Seems like a pretty rosy picture of one of the worst dictators in modern history. Joining us on the line to discuss is Helen Andrews. Helen, thanks so much for your time.
Thanks so much for having me.
So, for folks who don't know anything about Zimbabwe's history or Robert Mugabe, can you give kind of a brief history of who Robert Mugabe was and why anybody should care?
Sure. Well, in the 1960s, when the so-called winds of change were sweeping through Africa and liberation of the former European colonies was clearly in the offing, a lot of nationalist leaders arose in the country, now Zimbabwe, then called Rhodesia. And some of them were committed to working through existing institutions. They wanted to build up electoral power on the part of Africans. There were others who believed in armed struggle, and Mugabe was the worst of these. He had no commitment to the rule of law or to Western ideas of democracy. He was basically a communist-style radical. And so after a long, drawn-out war between the Rhodesian government and the African insurgents, Zimbabwe gained its independence in 1980, and Mugabe was, I'll say, elected in their first election, but I don't know if that's really the right word to use to describe an election that was marred by endemic voter intimidation. He came to power at by the gun, and then ruled as a strongman until 2017. So for about 40 years.
Helen, I'm sorry. The reception is actually quite bad. I think we're going to have to try and reconnect. So we'll do that in 1 second. The bottom line is that Robert Mugabe was one of the worst dictators in Africa, and he routinely cracked down on all sorts of human rights. Helen's piece over at National Review says, reflecting in the late 1970s on the prospect of a Mugabe election victory, the conservative historian Robert Blake commented placidly, "The right to misgovern oneself is as valid as any other political right, and it is exercised more often than most. After 35 years of ethnic cleansing, political murder, intimidation by rape, economic suicide, and massive depopulation from famine, emigration, and AIDS, this fatalism has not worn well. Those who would join in moral condemnation of Mugabe now that he is gone should have come up with a better answer to how things could have gone so wrong than to shrug with Lord Blake that democracy wants what it wants. Even divine right monarchies had their tactful regencies and pragmatic sanctions. Modern Democrats should be able to display at least as much imaginative flexibility as people who believed their rulers were ordained by God, if not in time to do any good, then at least in retrospect." And she talks about what could have been done differently. Does Helen Andrews over at National Review. She says, if only Rhodesia had been governed better, its oppressed native population would not have presented such an easy foothold to Marxist guerrillas. Alas, this particular oasis is a mirage, not because conditions for Africans were so splendid under Ian Smith and his predecessors, but because no amount of peace, prosperity, and good government has ever been a prophylactic against violent nationalism when other factors have made it an advantageous ideology to embrace. In other words, she's saying that it really was not about the governance of Rhodesia. It was really about the nationalist aspirations of people who were violent. And Mugabe was one of these. He says it was, for precisely this reason, a waste of breath for Rhodesians to defend the regime on the facts. Secondary school attendance among black Africans was higher in Rhodesia than anywhere else on that continent in 1960. Spending on African education tripled in the 7 years before Rhodesia's unilateral declaration of independence in 1965. A quarter of the students at the Integrated National University were black. The problem was that it was still governed by a minority. And she talks about then how Robert Mugabe proceeded to govern, and the answer is in the most brutal fashion humanly possible. She says many have fixated on Reverend Abel Muzorewa, the moderate nationalist who served as prime minister of Zimbabwe and Rhodesia in 1979, who was it is generally agreed was egregiously betrayed when Jimmy Carter refused to recognize his government or lift sanctions, even though his election was entirely democratic. But it's likely that it would have fallen to Mugabe sooner or later. Bottom line is that it's difficult to say what steps might have prevented Mugabe from coming to power. And once he was in power, he proceeded to centralize power. This, the attempt to blame the West for all of the problems in Rhodesia, and particularly in Zimbabwe after the end of the Rhodesian government, nationalism and fighting for the rights of the people to govern themselves do not necessarily end with those people being treated well by their government. Democracy, in other words, is not necessarily a cure-all. Now, that does not mean that it's not the worst, that there are no better, that it's the best available alternative. But if the alternatives were bad, Mugabe was the worst of all possible alternatives. And it didn't have to be that way because Mugabe could have been a Nelson Mandela figure. Instead, he was not. He says, she says, Helen Andrews, Zimbabwe's fate today is that of Britain after the withdrawal of the Romans. With the fall of that earlier empire, coinage disappeared, barter returned, wheeled pottery was not seen again for 300 years. Now that Mugabe is gone, we may be lucky and get a successor for Zimbabwean King Arthur. But it is sobering to reflect, especially with China hovering in the wings, that the ruler for whom Britain had to wait before history could begin again was William the Conqueror, which is a pretty dark vision of what's going to happen in Zimbabwe next. It's a Friday, and it is that time of the day and that time of the week. It's time for a Friday phone frenzy. Alliteration for you there. 855-236-3228. That's 855-236-3228. Lisa in Queens, New York. You're on the Ben Shapiro Show. Go for it, Lisa.
Hi, Ben. Can you hear me?
I can hear you just fine.
Thank you. You sound like a Democrat. You attack Trump every minute. You're applauding. You're rooting for a Democrat to become president in 2020. And you always say, oh, it's great for the Democrats in 2020, but it's bad for Republicans in Trump 2020. You're a Democrat and you're pro-BDS. So, if you're automatically an anti-Semite if you're a Democrat. That's the way we feel. You defend Ilhan Omar. You defended
Lisa,
Rashida
I think you've
Tlaib.
dialed into the wrong program, and I appreciate the call. If you think that I have defended Ilhan Omar, you're certainly not listening to this show. If you believe that I support BDS, an Orthodox Jew who is the most pro-Israel commentator in America probably, I'm going to go no on that. If you think I want a Democrat to win after I spend nearly every show railing against the extremism and insanity of the Democratic Party, I think that's wild. But if you believe that I criticize President Trump, that's true, because I would like to see President Trump do better. So here's the thing. I'm not I am not nearly as confident as a lot of folks that President Trump has this thing wrapped up. I'm not confident because I just don't see the evidence of that. I don't see him winning by wide margins in any of the states that he won last time. I don't see a single poll that shows him doing that. I don't see a single national poll that shows him wiping the floor with his opponents. So I'm uncomfortable. I would like to see him win. I don't want to see Elizabeth Warren, God forbid, as president. I don't want to see Joe Biden, old, slow Joe, as president. I don't want to see any of these Democrats as president. Are you crazy? What? What I would like to see is President Trump do better as president so that it makes it easier for people to vote for him. The art of politics is making it very difficult for people to vote for your opponent. Trump is good at that. He's good at ripping down his opponents and also making it very easy for people to vote for you and the people in your party. And this is where President Trump has a bit of a problem, as evidenced by the 2018 election. I'm not going to pretend that everything that Trump says is an act of masterful genius when the evidence suggests otherwise in electoral terms. I'm also not going to suggest that everything he says is the end of the world or that everything he says is dead serious and we have to pretend that it's a crisis or anything like that. But what you are owed when you listen to the show is an objective, conservative take on politics. And if you are so non-objective that you believe that I'm supporting Ilhan Omar and BDS, I literally do not know what show you're listening to. Somehow you got this channel switched with Air America. Don't know what to tell you. Craig in California, you're on the Ben Shapiro Show. Go for it, Craig.
Wow. Hey, Ben.
How are you doing, dude?
Good, man. Hey, bud. So for certain, you definitely, I will second that you have never,
yeah, no, it's crazy. We can leave that one
Omar.
behind, Craig.
Fair enough.
Well, what's your question? Go for
All right,
it.
fair enough. All right. So, hey, listen, my question is flat out, is it too late to protect our free speech? And I say this because free speech is already under fire. If you disagree with any arguments from the left or show support for a cause, you're scrutinized, banned, demonetized. Look at Crowder, dude.
Yep.
Comedians can't even make jokes anymore. If you can't laugh at ourselves, then what? It becomes a point when conservatives are being driven underground to spare their businesses or personal life. And I run my own business.
Yep.
You went to the Capitol to speak about free speech, the free speech debacle going on with social media.
Yep.
Many conservative voices are out there telling supporters to speak out, but it seems we're losing the battle. Is it too late to protect our free speech?
Now, Craig, I don't think it's too late to protect our free speech, but I do think that we are at an inflection point. And what that inflection point is right now is that it is, in fact, dangerous for people who don't have my job. Like, I have a nice job. I get to come in and say what I think every day. But a lot of people work in businesses where they don't get to say what they think every day for fear of the blowback. And we're at an inflection point right now where the left is dominant in trying to cancel people and ruin them. But what that's going to create... Free speech is like a balloon. If you try to grab one end of the balloon, the other end of the balloon inflates. Right now, what we are feeling is the vice grip of the left on one end of the balloon, but the other end of the balloon is inflating, and that is all of the pressure moving to the other side in favor of free speech. Because even folks on the left, I mean, you point out that people are coming after Chappelle, for example. Dave Chappelle is going to keep saying what he's saying, and he's going to open up a new space for comedians to do all of that. What the left is going to force everybody into doing is basically congregating with their own kind politically. Now, I don't like that. I think it's really bad, but I think that that's the natural effect. I don't think the natural effect is a complete shutdown in conservative speech. I do think it's going to be political segregation, which is bad for the republic, but still maintains the ability to have free speech, Craig.
Second question, really quick. And with this forced silence happening on social media, will the silent majority avail again in 2020, Ben?
You know, Craig, I really appreciate the call. I certainly hope so. I do think that the backlash is going to be very strong. And again, that's about conservatives making it very easy to vote for them, not about them making it difficult to vote for the other side. I think most people right now are really turned off of politics. I think most people are turned off by both parties. I mean, I think that's what Trump was about. He hijacked one major party from the outside. People are really dissatisfied with the establishment, and that hasn't changed just because Trump is in the White House. I think that people are looking for alternative methods of connecting with one another. I am actually optimistic that there will be more of that in the future. I think we're living in what I hope is the hardest time. It gets, there are two variant phrases. I'm not sure which one applies here, that it's always darkest just before the dawn, or it's always darkest just before it goes pitch black. I'm not sure which one to side with, Craig, but I really appreciate the call, and thanks for listening, dude.
Thanks, Ben.
Okay, let's see. Enrique in Texas. You're on the Ben Shapiro Show. Go for it, Enrique.
Hey, Ben. This is Enrique. How are you doing?
Doing well, sir. Go for it.
All right. So I, as a Hispanic conservative, I've been kind of criticized at moments for being a conservative in the first place, since the left usually suggests that Hispanics can't be conservative. My question is, how exactly can I present this conservative message, particularly to groups such as Hispanics? Since whenever I try to present it to people, I try to present Reagan and the idea that said that Hispanics are conservative, they just don't know it. And I asked this because recently with the Reagan-Nixon phone call coming out with him talking about using a derogatory slur for African people.
Yes.
I don't know how to exactly address things like that when it comes to
yeah, I mean, Enrique, I think it's a great question. I think it's a great question. So for folks who missed it, there was a story in which somebody revealed an old tape from President Nixon's term. It was like 1973, and Governor Reagan, who was then governor of California, called up Nixon and used an ugly slur talking about African leaders. And it was a racist slur used on this phone call. And this has been used by a lot of folks on the left to suggest that Reagan was a thoroughgoing racist and therefore his policies are racist. And Enrique, I honestly think that the best way to approach these issues is with a simple recognition that human beings are human beings and are multifaceted. That some people may say ugly things behind closed doors, and some people may say dumb things, and some people may say bigoted things. But if you are going to jump to make a decision about policy on the basis of human beings are flawed and are sinful and do sinful things, well, then no one's ever going to make policy, because it turns out everybody says bad things behind closed doors. Everybody has made terrible jokes. Everybody has friends they regret having had and has said things they regret having said. And people change over time. A little forgiveness would be necessary. And if they don't believe you, then it's pretty easy to point to people on the left. And that's not a whataboutism game. That's saying it's bad when it happens on the right. It's bad when it happens on the left. But when we're talking about which policy moves the country forward, we need to, instead of looking at the people, which is a character attack, we need to look at the policy that moves the country forward. After all, we're not electing these people to be our friends or even really to be our moral guidance counselors. We're electing these people to implement policy. And I think, frankly, that's the best way to argue in favor of politicians, because let's be real, most politicians are schmucks.
Yeah, for sure, agreed.
Well, Enrique, I really appreciate the call, and thanks so mull for listening. Andrew in Bakersville, North Carolina, you're on the Ben Shapiro Show. Go for it, Andrew.
How you doing, Ben?
Doing well. Go for it, sir.
You had said in the past, if you were elected president, that you would do your best to shrink the executive branch. And I was just wondering, how exactly, with it being so big now, how would you go about doing that?
Well, like Ted Cruz, I would disband the IRS. I would simplify the tax code so that you can simply fill it out on the back of a postcard. I would also get rid of a bevy of departments, including certainly the Department of Education. But also I'd be looking at the Department of Homeland Security merging back with the Department of Defense. I'd be looking at downgrading a lot of the funding that goes to the Department of Health and Human Services. I think a lot of that should be done on the state level. President Trump has been cutting a lot of regulations. We also need to cut a lot of regulators and kick the problems back to Congress. If Congress doesn't like how the regulations are going, very simple solution. You could do your job and legislate. You are the legislature.
Right.
Well, Andrew,
do
really
you think
appreciate.
That there's any possibility of that actually happening?
I mean, I do think there's possibility of that happening. I think President Trump has cut regulations. I think that people are scared of the blowback of eliminating entire departments of government, which is why Reagan promised to get rid of the Department of Education and then didn't. But frankly, I think that the blowback would be temporary and loud, and then people would get used to it. The fact is that the executive branch has become too powerful. It's hard to make the case that a president is a tyrant when he's trying to eliminate his own power. And that's the favorite case of the media, is that the president is a tyrant. How do you call a president a tyrant when he's eliminating people who work for him? It's a very bizarre argument. Really appreciate the call, Andrew. Casey in Warren, Michigan. You're on the Ben Shapiro Show. Go for it, Casey.
Hey, good afternoon. Hope you have a wonderful weekend, Ben. I love your books and I love your shows.
Hey, really appreciate it.
I want to ask you a question. You were talking about inflection points. I think we've come to an inflection point with gun laws and gun control, just like abortion and immigration. We can't give it to the left. We can't let the motions dictate what we do. But what do these people think federal background checks, red flag laws, federal laws are going to do when the immigration federal laws are being ignored?
I mean, this is a great question, Casey.
The same results.
It's a great question. I mean, the fact is that there is this very bizarre interpretation of the supremacy clause of the Constitution that says that the federal government is superior to the state governments in areas that the federal government occupies. For the left, they say that states are forbidden from enforcing federal law on immigration. So if Arizona wants to help the federal government pick up illegal immigrants and then deport them, then that is illegal. According to the courts, the Obama administration fought this out with Jan Brewer's government in Arizona. However, if states want to set up sanctuary cities, then presumably that's okay. Well, how do they think that this is going to operate in the field of gun control? Do they really think that the federal government is going to be capable of going into Texas without any help from the local authorities and seizing guns? Is that really going to go well? The fact is that you're going to have a dramatic growth in the size, scope, and interference of the federal government if you want any sort of that intrusive policy to pass. And I think, frankly, that's what the Democrats want. But I don't think it's practical. I don't think it's practicable. And Casey, I really do appreciate the call. John in New Jersey, you're on the Ben Shapiro Show. Go for it, John.
Can you hear me?
I can. Go for it, sir.
Okay. My question is, what advice would you give a 24-year-old who's interested in politics? What would I need to do to get into the field and advance?
Well, I mean, it depends what you want to do in politics. So politics is an entire field, right? It's like saying, how do you get into healthcare? It depends. Do you want to be an administrator? Do you want to be a doctor? What do you actually want to do in politics, John?
So I actually want to work my way up through the House and then Congress, and then eventually my dream is president.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the first thing to do is get involved at the local level, right? Get involved with your local party. See if you can run for a local office. Build connections, build resume, and then move from there. I mean, that's one path. The other path is you can do what Donald Trump did, become very, very successful in another field, and then transfer that success over into running for high office. That seems to lately be the easier way to do it for so many folks, right? Is that they become extraordinarily wealthy, and then they just kind of parachute into a race and run for Senate or run for governor. I will say that's what's nice about that is you get rich in the process. Working your way up from the lowest level and working in politics, you ain't going to get rich that way. Much better to go work for Goldman Sachs for 10 years, become very rich, and then just run directly for Congress, and you can self-fund your campaign. So, I mean, if I were just going to recommend a lifestyle choice to get into politics, the Trump path is a lot more lucrative and more fun, I think, than getting into local politics. However, if you want to be guaranteed that you end up in politics, then starting at the local level and working your way up is the best way to do it, John. Jason in Brooklyn, New York. Let's do Jason. You're on the Ben Shapiro Show. Go for it, Jason.
Hello, Ben. I love your show.
I appreciate it. Go for it.
Thank you very much for taking my call.
You bet.
So I'm Jewish, just like you. I'm Orthodox. I go to a Jewish school. And they have this left-wing teacher for history. And occasionally we have discussions, sometimes after class, about politics. And last year, at the end of the year, he called me over after class, and he told me that historically the conservative movement was very anti-progress. These are the words he used. He said they were anti-capitalism, they were anti-the American Revolution. I just wanted to know what you would respond to that, because I'm going back to his class on Monday.
I mean, Jason, well, I appreciate the call. I mean, first of all, it's nonsense. The reason that it is nonsense specifically is because it depends how you're defining conservative. If by conservative you just mean people who are guarding the past, then obviously, by definition, they're anti-progress. But when you speak about American conservatism, you're talking about a very specific brand of idea. That brand suggests that there are God-given rights, that government is instituted in order to protect those God-given rights, and that government must be limited in order to prevent government from attempting to invade those rights. How that's anti-progress or anti-capitalism is absolutely beyond me. It doesn't make any sense. Jason, tell your teacher that he ought to read a history book, and maybe he ought to read a book by Milton Friedman. Maybe he ought to read my book on the history of Western civilization. Maybe he ought to read a book, it sounds like, because that's a pretty ignorant perspective on history. Joel, you're on the Ben Shapiro Show in Colorado Springs. Go for it, Joel.
Hi, Mr. Shapiro. I was just calling to ask, how would you differentiate between populism and conservatism, and where do you think the American right is headed in the near future?
Well, I think that the way to distinguish between populism and conservatism is that populism isn't actually a set of ideas. It's an approach. This is why Bernie Sanders can be a populist, and Donald Trump can be a populist, and Tucker Carlson can be a populist, and they can all disagree on approach. Populism is basically an appeal to the people. I mean, that's what the name means. And you can make that populist appeal in a variety of ways. Reagan made a populist appeal by saying that government is out to destroy the rights of the people and override your belief system. Any good politician, any successful politician will be to a certain extent populist. Populist has become for the media a catch-all term, meaning anti-establishment and anti-immigration. So they're now using it as a derogatory, but that's not really what populism is. Again, it's an approach. So there's conservative populism, there's non-conservative populism. I think that any philosophy that tries to sell itself is eventually, in a democratic system, going to have to make an appeal to the authority of the people. I think that where conservatism and populism come into conflict is where you are arguing for rights that matter more than the democratic vote, right? There are certain rights that are not subject to democratic vote. So the right to free speech is not subject to veto by a democratic majority. The right to self-defense is not subject to a veto by a democratic majority. And when those two come into conflict, that's when populism and conservatism come into conflict. The power of the people does not trump fundamental rights. When those aren't in conflict, then they can exist in perfect coincidence. Joel, I really appreciate the call. Brian in Iowa, you're on the Ben Shapiro Show. Go for it, Brian.
Oh, hey, Ben. Nice to meet you on the phone.
Good to meet you, too.
So my question is, I live in Iowa. It's a different culture, different scenario. You know, we respect our gun laws. We're very pro-Constitution, First Amendment, Second Amendment, et cetera. How do these Bernie Sanders, Joe Bidens expect me to even vote for them? And granted, I'm Republican, but when they're trying to take away my guns, they're trying to give me universal health care, raise my taxes, et cetera. But, I mean, they live in a whole different world than I do. And they basically pretend we don't exist. Just wondering your thoughts on that.
Yeah, Brian, I think this is right. I mean, I think this is why President Trump has been doing better in states like Iowa that share conservative values than he's been doing in states like Arizona, which are a little bit more left-leaning or purple-leaning in terms of their values. Democrats, I don't think, care about Iowa's rural voters. I think the reason that Democrats are right now pushing against the Electoral College is because they believe that if they appeal directly to urban elitists who believe not in patriotism or in church or in family, but believe in sort of a cosmopolitan viewpoint that favors free social arrangements outside the scope of social institutions, that favors big government as the great militator against conflict. You know, the Democrats are banking on that. So I think they are expecting that as populations move, they will win. Democrats, in other words, are banking on demographic change, and Republicans are banking on values, which is why Republicans had better be excellent expositors of their values, because if they are not, then the demographic changes will swamp them, Brian.
All right, thank you.
Well, I really appreciate the call. Doug in Toronto, you're on the Ben Shapiro Show. Go for it, Doug.
Hi, Ben. Thanks for taking my call. I really appreciate it. Loved your book, by the way, Right Side of History. Recommend everybody get it.
Hey, thank you so much.
Do you think that mainstream media basically died when journalists or when lawyers became journalists? Because no longer it's what they should say, you know, backing up their sources, make sure they have everything. It's what can they legally say. For example, if true, yada, yada, yada.
I think that that's always been a risk. I mean, look, the risk of a free speech system, not like Britain's, where you have really strong sanctions on libel, where you actually have to prove that what you're saying is true in order to avoid a libel charge. But in the United States, where you have to prove malice, you know, the fact that that system has always allowed for more muckraking. It's allowed people to skate along the edge of journalism and activism. I frankly think that that's a good thing. I think that when journalism began to die is in the 40s and 50s, when there was this broad consensus in America about how America should be. And there was this weird attempt to shoehorn that broad consensus into a belief that the media was inherently objective. Doug, I really appreciate the call. And thanks to everybody who called in on this Friday, final hour phone frenzy. We'll get to more of your calls maybe next hour, or perhaps we will just be talking about all of the issues of the day, including the woke Scold Democrats. You know, President Trump may not be popular, but the woke Scold Democrats are so damned irritating. This is the Ben Shapiro Show.